The air inside the courtroom was suffocating. Seated at the defendant's table was Jordan Hayes, a 17-year-old kid from the wrong side of town. He sat stiffly, his hands clenched in his lap, trying to keep his emotions in check. Across the bench, Judge Harold Whitmore peered down at him over the rim of his glasses, expression cold, unyielding. "This is a waste of time," Judge Whitmore muttered as he shuffled the case files. "Another young punk thinking he can take what doesn't belong to him." Jordan's stomach twisted, because he hadn't stolen anything. But no one in this room seemed to care. The prosecutor, a self-righteous man named James Rourke, stepped forward, his voice dripping with confidence. "Your Honor, the case is clear. The defendant was caught at Hartley's convenience store, where a reported $800 was stolen from the cash register. Security footage shows him inside the store just minutes before the money went missing." He gestured toward Jordan. "And let's not ignore the obvious. He has a prior record for shoplifting." Jordan gritted his teeth. Yes, he had made a mistake when he was 14. But he had served his time in a youth program. He had changed. But none of that mattered now. Judge Whitmore sighed. "So, what's your excuse this time, Mr. Hayes?" Jordan's jaw tightened. "I didn't do it," he said, his voice firm. Judge Whitmore scoffed. "Of course you didn't." The courtroom chuckled. Because in their minds, this was already over. But what they didn't know, what no one in that room expected, was that the real thief was about to be exposed. And it was someone no one would have suspected. The courtroom buzzed with quiet snickers as Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. "Let me guess," he said, rubbing his temple. "You just happened to be in the store? Wrong place? Wrong time?" Jordan's hands tightened into fists. "Yes," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "I was there to buy chips and a soda. That's all." The prosecutor smirked. "And yet, the security footage shows you in the store 2 minutes before the register was emptied. Coincidence?" Jordan exhaled sharply. This wasn't a trial. This was a public execution. Then, his lawyer, a tired-looking public defender, stood. "Your Honor," she said, flipping through a thin folder. "There's a serious gap in this case." Judge Whitmore sighed. "Get on with it." She turned to the prosecutor. "The security footage only shows my client inside the store. But where's the footage of him actually taking the money?" The courtroom quieted. Even the prosecutor hesitated. "The camera near the register wasn't working," Rourke admitted. Jordan lifted his head. There it was. They had been so sure he was guilty, but they had no actual proof. Jordan's lawyer pressed forward. "So let's summarize. My client was in the store, but there's no footage of him stealing anything. And yet, we're supposed to believe this is an open and shut case?" She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the state has failed to provide direct evidence of the crime." Judge Whitmore narrowed his eyes. He didn't like being challenged. He was ready to dismiss the argument, until Jordan spoke up. "If I stole the money," Jordan said, meeting the judge's eyes, "then where is it?" The room fell silent. Jordan leaned forward. "You searched me. You checked my house. Where's the money?" Judge Whitmore frowned. He hadn't considered that. For the first time, doubt crept into his face. Then suddenly, a voice from the back of the room. "Maybe you should be asking that question to someone else." All heads snapped around, because standing near the back was the store owner, and his face looked pale. All eyes turned toward Mr. Hartley, the owner of the convenience store. His face was pale, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. Judge Whitmore narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Hartley, do you have something to say?" The store owner licked his lips nervously. He hesitated. I think you should be looking at someone else." A murmur spread through the gallery. Even Jordan's heart pounded. Ava Sinclair, Jordan's public defender, pounced. "Who exactly should we be looking at, Mr. Hartley?" Hartley hesitated again. Then, his eyes flicked toward someone in the courtroom. The prosecutor, James Rourke. Jordan felt his stomach drop. Judge Whitmore's gaze darkened. Mr. Hartley, I strongly suggest you speak clearly. Now. Hartley exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging. I didn't report the real thief, he admitted, because the person who took the money was my own employee. The courtroom exploded. People gasped. Jordan's hands gripped the table. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. And who is this employee? Hartley swallowed hard. Then he said the name. Daniel Rourke. The prosecutor's younger brother. The room went dead silent. The color drained from James Rourke's face. My brother? He stammered. That's ridiculous. But Hartley wasn't done. I have proof, he said. I didn't turn it over because I was scared of, well, him. He gestured toward the prosecutor. Judge Whitmore's expression turned cold. Mr. Hartley, are you telling this court that the actual thief is connected to the prosecution? Hartley nodded miserably. Jordan exhaled slowly. He had been accused, humiliated, treated like a criminal, and yet, the real thief had been protected all along. Judge Whitmore turned to the bailiff. Find Daniel Rourke, immediately. The case had just exploded wide open. The courtroom was no longer a place of certainty. Everything Judge Whitmore had assumed about this case was crumbling before his eyes. The defendant, the young black teen he had dismissed as a common thief, was innocent. And the real criminal? Someone much closer to the case. Judge Whitmore turned to the prosecutor, James Rourke, his expression steely. Mr. Rourke, he said, his voice sharp, did you know your brother was involved in this crime? Rourke's face was red, his jaw tight. Your Honor, I had no knowledge of his involvement. Judge Whitmore wasn't convinced. And yet you pushed forward with this case despite the complete lack of direct evidence against Mr. Hayes. Rourke swallowed hard. The security footage was incomplete, Judge Whitmore interrupted. He leaned forward, his fingers pressed together. Did you ever consider the possibility that Mr. Hayes was telling the truth? Rourke didn't answer, because everyone in the room knew the answer. Ava Sinclair, Jordan's public defender, stood. Your Honor, my client has endured public humiliation, wrongful detention, and a baseless trial because of a prosecution that ignored the lack of evidence. She turned toward Rourke. And now we learn that the real thief was protected, whether knowingly or unknowingly, by the very man trying to send Jordan to prison. Judge Whitmore exhaled slowly. He looked at Jordan. For the first time, his eyes weren't filled with judgment, they were filled with regret. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. Mr. Hayes, he said, his voice firm but different this time, almost reluctant. I owe you an apology. Jordan blinked. He had never expected to hear those words from this man. You should never have been in this courtroom, Judge Whitmore continued. You were judged unfairly before the trial even began. He turned to the bailiff. This court is issuing an immediate dismissal of all charges against Mr. Hayes. Jordan's breath hitched. It was over. He was finally free. But for Rourke and his brother? Their troubles were just beginning. The courtroom was stunned into silence. Jordan Hayes, the boy they had labeled a criminal, was now a free man. But for James Rourke and his brother? Their nightmare was just beginning. Judge Whitmore turned to the bailiff. Locate and detain Daniel Rourke immediately. This court will not allow a thief to walk free while an innocent man was nearly condemned. The bailiff nodded and left the courtroom. Then, Judge Whitmore's gaze settled on James Rourke. You, Mr. Rourke, he said, his voice cold, are not off the hook either. Rourke's face went pale. Your Honor, Whitmore held up a hand. Don't. He shook his head. This case was built on nothing but assumptions and bias. You ignored the fact that the prosecution had no concrete evidence. You pushed forward because it was convenient. His stare hardened. That is not justice. That is recklessness. Rourke swallowed hard. I was just following the evidence presented. There was no evidence, Judge Whitmore snapped, his patience gone. You treated Mr. Hayes like he was guilty from the start, and now we find out that your own brother is the real criminal? A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Even Rourke's own colleagues looked uncomfortable. Judge Whitmore turned to the state's ethics committee representative, who had been quietly watching from the back. "I strongly suggest that an internal investigation be launched into Mr. Rourke's handling of this case." The representative nodded. Rourke slumped in his chair. Because this wasn't just about Jordan Hayes anymore. This was about his entire career. Jordan stood slowly. His voice was calm, but powerful. "You all wanted to believe I was guilty," he said, looking directly at Rourke and the judge. "You never even considered that, maybe. You were wrong." The room fell silent. Because deep down, they knew he was right. And for the first time, it was them who had to answer for their mistakes. The weight of Jordan's words hung in the air like a thundercloud. The courtroom, the place that had almost stolen his future, was now dead silent. Judge Whitmore exhaled slowly. Because Jordan Hayes wasn't wrong, they had assumed his guilt, treated him like he was already convicted. And now, the truth was staring them in the face. Judge Whitmore straightened in his chair. His voice, for the first time, held genuine authority, not arrogance. "This court formally drops all charges against Mr. Hayes," he announced, effective immediately. A ripple of relief spread through Jordan's body. It was finally over. But the judge wasn't done. He turned to the ethics committee representative. "I am formally recommending that Prosecutor James Rourke be placed under internal review. His willingness to push forward with a factually weak case, combined with a clear conflict of interest, has no place in this court." Rourke sank lower in his seat. He had walked into this case expecting an easy conviction. Instead, he had destroyed his career. At that moment, the courtroom doors swung open. The bailiff returned, this time with Daniel Rourke in handcuffs. The younger Rourke looked panicked. "Wait, this is a mistake. I didn't—" Judge Whitmore cut him off. "You will have your day in court," he said. "But today, justice belongs to Mr. Hayes." As Daniel Rourke was led away, Jordan Hayes stood, turning toward his attorney, Ava Sinclair. She smiled proudly. "You fought back," she said. "That's what won this case." Jordan let out a slow breath, then glanced at Judge Whitmore one last time. The judge met his gaze. There was no arrogance left, no scorn, only regret. Jordan didn't need an apology. He had already won. And as he walked out of the courtroom a free man, he knew one thing for sure. No one would ever underestimate him again.